On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Tony Dong. He is the Senior Director of Engineering at Rippling. We're going to be talking about maintaining a startup mindset while scaling the team. He has seen some incredible growth from an engineering perspective, like 2 to close to 140 plus, and going through that and seeing how to kind of keep yourself nimble, but allow people the right amount of autonomy, allow them to be inventive. Definitely some challenges, and Tony's here to talk us through how he has navigated that. Tony, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Let's start off at the top and understand two things. One, what does Rippling do? And then secondly, as a Senior Director of Engineering, what are some of those responsibilities that you have?
Yeah, so Rippling, I think of it as like the first way for businesses to really manage all of their HR, IT, payroll, finance, everything all in one unified platform. Think about like how you're running your company day to day, right? Every product that you're using, every individual SaaS product has a sprinkling of employee data within it. It could be things like your simple like identity or email or your department, team, work location, manager, etc. Right? Maintaining that fidelity of data across all these different systems, which are usually disconnected, and essentially is like managing data across multiple databases. Right. And this is why like a lot of companies have very convoluted processes on making change management, access management, and will typically have armies of HR, IT people. Rippling kind of solves this problem by giving companies, employees a single platform to manage everything and knows everything about your company and can orchestrate everything in a way that just makes sense for you. Right. My role right now is leading the HR products and platform here at the company. The HR product centers around a lot of the core employee information, basically how all these different systems interconnect with each other and linking back to that core employee information. And platform side provides a lot of the underlying technologies and products that tie everything together, like unified permissions, approvals, workflows, reports, RQL, etc. Everything we kind of bundle under the idea of Rippling Unity.
Awesome. All right. So topic is, maintaining that startup mindset as your team is scaling. I guess, before we start, let's talk about, you mentioned growth. I think it's good to kind of just understand what that context means. Like when we talk about scaling for you and your team, what does that look like over the last few years?
Yeah. So I joined September 2019. So just over 3 years from when we're recording this podcast here. So I think in that kind of 3 years has gone through tons of different phases of growth, right? And again, growing the team from I think 2 other people when I started to now 140 plus. We've gone through phases initially where we're just trying to basically kind of rebuild and get to the point of the team where we can build and actually live sustainably, right? So those first couple of months were definitely just like, hey, trying to catch up and make sure we're not kind of like just overwhelmed by the amount of like, support tickets, amount of like operational work we need to do day to day. Right. Kind of as we've continued to scale the team, we've started to be able to then define the individual sub teams and the kind of like team structure long term, right? Start to define the vision behind the HR product area as well as the platform area. And those two areas kind of like continue to blossom there afterwards. And then we were able to get into a position of kind of being able to now look more ambitious and look at the kind of like bigger product roadmap and look at the things like Rippling Unity, which I've just mentioned, right? So during that period, we've had to kind of like scale the team and scale the processes accordingly as well.
Absolutely. And I guess, I think it'd be interesting to talk about, I hear a lot, and I think it's talked about a lot about, kind of staying agile, maintaining the startup mindset. I guess when you kind of think about maintaining a startup mindset, why is it important to you? Like, what is it about that will help your team? Obviously, no one wants bureaucracy and red tape, but what is some of that kernel of, we got to maintain, this X factor?
I think the startup mindset really has 3 different components that are like really core to kind of how we operate as Rippling, right? one is around kind of like bias to action, right? Not just waiting around for kind of like someone to tell you what to do, or like, waiting around, go through huge committees or, long design processes before actually getting something on like out into the world, or getting something that you can kind of like prove out your ideas, right? I think that has helped us kind of like build a lot of different ideas and products, and build them very quickly and get to like test that product and test with product with customers, right? Another component of kind of like that startup mindset is around thinking bigger, right? Being more ambitious. I think a lot of times when you're stuck in trying to optimize in one area, or like trying to like really think about one very, very small specific problem, you kind of lose sight of what is really possible if you kind of like step back and build something bigger, and being able to maintain a team that has that kind of like mindset of being ambitious kind of really is really helpful going forward. And then I think the last thing is around like kind of looser boundaries and lack of tight, or lack of like well-defined team boundaries, right? So I think one of the things that you get as you kind of like go into bigger companies or more established companies, there's a mindset of like, oh, that's not my responsibility, that's someone else's. Hey, I'm gonna bounce Jira tickets around until something gets done. And that's not really productive and never really helps anyone, right? So I think we want to find a way to help the team continue having that, like, hey, we're in this together, we're delivering together. How do we get this done? And not go into the, that's really your team or my team thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as you started with two, you have a lot more now. 140 plus engineers, and as you start hiring and you're bringing different people in, different mindsets, different backgrounds, right? Working at startups, big companies, things will start changing. To a degree, obviously that's good. Bringing all those different perspectives to the table will help. How do you start picking and choosing what becomes the culture at, right? Because you can't have everyone wanting to do things their own way, because obviously early days, there's a lot less eyes on process. There might be minimal process, but how do you start paying attention to, hey, like these are the processes that we need to build upon, and obviously that's going to kind of help be the foundation.
Culture is kind of an interesting concept, right? Because culture is not something you can like just define and say, hey, everyone acts this way, right? Culture is really the people and what you observe as the kind of cultural norms out of the people, right? So that's really why it's so important to think carefully and deliberately about every single person that you're hiring, and thinking about who are the kind of like culture adds, and making sure that you're not finding people who go kind of like on the opposite spectrum of what you're trying to define as your company culture, right? Or what you're looking to see as your company culture. So again, like it's not like we only hire startup people and like we never hire from big companies. In fact, we have tons of people from all different backgrounds, all different kind of like types of engineers. I think really it's looking at the things that we want to be promoting, right? The three ideas and tenets that we talked about previously, right? Which is thinking bigger, being kind of like be able to break down team boundaries and bias to action, right? Those are things that we're looking for in my hiring manager calls, in our kind of like interview process throughout, and making sure that we find people who can attend to those three core tenets really helps.
Absolutely, I agree. I think people are your culture. The people, the processes, what they embody becomes what your company stands for. I guess as you start becoming further removed from, hands-on, watching, you have managers that are reporting to you. How do you stay in touch with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it definitely gets harder and harder as the team scales. But one of the things that I really try to do is be hands-on in particular areas and really go. We have a concept within Rippling called go and see, right? Really just like, hey, like I can try to hear from like three layers of indirection, getting the telephone of like, hey, they said this, and then it gets translated to some other version and finally makes it up to me. Or I could just go and talk to the individual engineers, or go look at the code, or go look at the kind of like, or go sit in a meeting or et cetera, to be able to actually see what's happening day to day. It doesn't necessarily mean, hey, I'm going to go and like code out the entire thing or go and like, solve every support ticket in that area. But it means that I have sufficient context and capability in that area to be able to understand what's happening and have a fuller picture and be able to go and actually resolve those issues accordingly or help the team resolve those issues accordingly. Okay, one of my favorite shows actually is Undercover Bosses, right? It's kind of like that same idea, except I don't have to like, put on like a disguise to actually go see what's happening.
I like that. That's a good way of that's a good analogy. I think a lot of people probably will relate to that. I guess as you're talking, go and see. I guess on the flip side, when a startup is early stage, it's very sales requirements driven, right? We need to make a sale. Let's go implement this, or somebody needs this to get something over the hump. Let's go do it. As it matures, product managers come in and there's a roadmap, and they're taking the feedback and prioritizing. As you kind of start seeing the team grow, and you guys start seeing some of those, some of the separations formalize, right? What's that impact to the engineering team? Because obviously, when it was 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 engineers, you guys probably were getting dotted line feedback coming in pretty quick, pretty easy. You start getting some of that insulation naturally just because you get formalized teams and processes. How was that affected?
I think this is, again, coming back to the go and see mentality, right? So the same way I might go and see like individual support tickets and stuff, that's the expectation for the engineers as well, right? It's not just like, hey, I'm going to wait till the PM tells me this indirect feedback multiple layers removed. I'm going to go into Salesforce and look at the underlying kind of like customer communication so we can actually see what the customer is exactly saying, right? And the expectation for people working on individual verticals or individual areas is that they start to become that not just technical expert, but kind of like a product expert in that area as well. Again, like this is where I hire a lot of engineers with that mindset of like, never not my problem, right? These are things that like I need to be looking at, not just like siloing myself into the pure technical side. So that gives people kind of like a more well-rounded picture of what's happening on like, their product and decision. And this is why we trust a lot of people with kind of like giving that bottoms up feedback during roadmap and during like quarterly planning, right? Because they've been on the grounds that they're like talking to customers, they're seeing the feedback, they're seeing the technical side, they're seeing what the kind of like what we actually should be doing going forward.
How did the team structures change? I guess as you were kind of going from a few engineers to a lot of engineers, did you guys start off, full stack? Were you specialized, and then you kind of grew that? What happened to the team topology?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because we started with a pure backend team reporting to myself, and then we had kind of like a centralized front end team, which kind of like had almost like a rotating front end engineer, kind of like more like almost like a consultancy kind of like type. I think that didn't quite work well for us. So what we end up doing is kind of like having the individual like front end engineers start to be basically vertically aligned to each individual product area. So each team became more of a full stack team where you have back engineers, front end engineers. You occasionally have QAs depending on the team. You have PMs that are like just dedicated purely into this area, right? Again, like giving people like focus in that one area allows them to then be more understanding about the product, understanding about kind of what the customer is seeing.
Interesting. And actually, that's interesting. You start off with a team of backend developers. That I wouldn't have guessed that, but that's interesting how you guys evolved from there. You mentioned talking about bias to action. Obviously you need some autonomy to do that. You need people to go take initiative. As the team's growing and obviously processes being put in place, and I like to go and see, mindset. How do you start balancing, obviously this freedom to go and be a little bit on the forward foot of learning and understanding with accountability? There's got to be some of both because obviously, we need some form of accountability. How does the team accountability balance?
The hardest thing for us is balancing accountability with kind of like psychological safety where you have the kind of like psychological safety to fail, right? So I think a lot of people get scared about that level of accountability, thinking like, hey, I have to be right 100% of the time, right? No one's right 100% of the time. You're allowed to make mistakes, and as long as you course correct effectively and efficiently, right? So I think a lot of times is setting that kind of like setting the example, setting the kind of like direction that, hey, you're accountable for this area, like you need to take action. And since you are kind of like the domain expert in this particular area, have that autonomy. You're given that autonomy to actually execute and kind of make those decisions. And again, like on the same side, like, hey, just because you're making a decision, we're not expecting you to be right 100% of the time, but make decisions based on framework, thinking about like, what is the kind of like revert to that decision, right? What is the worst case scenario? And how do we roll back a decision if needed? Like, making sure that you have as many optionalities with your decisions as possible. But with those sets of like frameworks in place, like we try to empower people to make those decisions locally, right? Think about what is the terminology here? Like think locally, act globally kind of situation.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely a balance because you're asking people to take risks, but also they know with risk comes accountability and downside. I was going to ask you. I mean, you've been at the company for a while. You've seen this growth. It's a big question, so I don't need you. It's more of a high level, just out of curiosity. Maybe it's a mindset thing. But when you're looking back now, and obviously you've experienced the positive growth, would you go back and potentially apply any learnings to, obviously trying to maintain this startup mindset? Is there anything that you'd have gone, hey, I could have potentially done something better or improved it?
I think one thing that I would have done a little bit earlier is to kind of like focus more on the recruiting process and think about the kind of like cultural interviews and et cetera earlier on in our kind of like team building. I think a lot of these kind of like ideas and like a lot of the kind of like cultural value questions really kind of like were evolved a little bit later in our interview process. So I would say, we're not perfect at hiring. We definitely had some false positives that kind of like detracted us from our overall goal, right? So I think for our case, like if I had to go back, I would probably day one really think about the interview process and kind of like how do we make sure we are very averse to false positives? Because like I think, false negatives, it's going to happen. And like, it's going to happen a lot with any interview process. Really, it's the false positives that really hurt you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good one because I think as you're in the heat and you're of the moment, you're looking to hire. It is a challenge. I mean, you're scaling. That's a lot of engineers over a couple of years, especially in the last couple of years. It's been a super competitive market. So good for the team for being able to hit those type of numbers. But I think the cultural side, obviously, as you mentioned, there's a cultural add, and there's an evolution to that. It definitely makes sense that the culture side would be something you'd go back and maybe look at earlier.
Yeah, I would say this is probably one of the hardest part about kind of like this job is to make sure that you are maintaining that quality bar and cultural bar at the same time you're trying to grow, right? You have on one side really pressure to like, hey, we need to deliver more things, we need to hire, we need to get the team and scale up. And I think on the other side, like, personally that like you have to maintain this engineering quality bar and cultural bar. Otherwise, if you start, bringing in people who don't quite fit that bar, it kind of like decays your team really way quicker than you think. Right. So in reality, hey, this team could have been 200 people or 250, right? At this point, but we kept our bar high and we make sure that the team is growing in a way that sets up for long-term success. And I think that's really the most important part of this job.
Awesome, Tony. Thank you for being on. I'm cognizant of the time. I was going to ask you that if you had a question, or a topic that you'd like a future guest to answer, what that would be.
I think one topic I would be really curious on a future leader to cover is around kind of like navigating engineering team in this kind of like current economic situation, right? Everyone has their opinions about how long this kind of like downturn will last. So it may last a little bit longer, and we're just trying to figure out like, hey, what are people doing to like keep up morale? What are people doing to make sure that they're running a lean team that is effective and that is kind of like maximizing output?
Awesome. That's a good one. I'm sure we'll hopefully find somebody to talk to that. I'm sure people would like to hear about that one as well. And then if somebody does want to reach out to you to talk about anything that you've covered on the podcast or just in general, what's a good way of getting hold of you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest. Should be very easy to find, and I'm also on Twitter. But again, pretty easy to find. Just Tony Dong. That's it.
Okay, we'll make sure we include those in the show notes so that people can find you. Tony, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Have a good one.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think the topic Tony mentioned, navigating an engineering team in the current economic situation, is interesting. I think a lot of people would be served well with a topic like that. So if you know someone or you yourself want to talk about that topic, reach out to me. Let me know. I'd love to have you on. Secondly, if the podcast is useful, share it, give it a review. A couple of 5-star reviews never heard. That's how the podcast has been growing, and I appreciate everyone who does that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.